The 1966 Blueprint Expanded. Chapter 1, The Echo of 1966, The World on the Brink. Welcome to Synapse Daily. Today, we are stepping back into a timeline where science and revolution collided in the most unlikely of places. The year is 1966. While the world was obsessed with the Cold War's nuclear threats, a different kind of power was being calculated in the heart of Santiago. Before we dive into the dusty streets of Chile, you should know that we've actually explored the origins of this thinking before. If you want to understand the raw science of how systems survive, you must watch our previous video, Stafford Beer's Viable System Model, UK, 1963. It covers the groundwork of everything we are about to discuss today. But in 1966, the theory stopped being a British academic exercise and started becoming a nation's backbone. Imagine a country that didn't just have a government, but a digital conscience. A nation that could feel its own hunger and react to its own pain. This is the birth of Project Cybersyn. Chapter 2, The Wizard Meets the Revolutionary. In 1966, the call went out across the Atlantic. Salvador Allende, then a rising political force, and his young technical advisor Fernando Flores, knew they were facing an impossible task. They wanted to manage a national economy without falling into the trap of Soviet-style central planning or American-style corporate greed. They needed the wizard. Stafford Beer. As we detailed in our 1963 documentary, Beer was already a legend in the UK for his radical ideas on management cybernetics. By 1966, he had reached a point of philosophical frustration in Europe. He felt the West was too rigid. When the Chileans reached out, Beer didn't see just a job, he saw a chance to prove that a science of liberty could actually exist. The meeting of Beer and the Chilean team was like lightning hitting a copper wire. They weren't just talking about computers, they were talking about human dignity. Beer brought the brain, the VSM, and the Chileans brought the heart, the passion for social justice. But how do you start a digital revolution in a place where most factories don't even have a reliable telephone line? Chapter 3, The VSM, the Nervous System, a refresher. Now, let's talk about the architecture. In 1966, Beer began mapping Chile's industries onto his viable system model. We won't go into the deep technical definitions of System 1 through 5 here. For a full breakdown of the VSM's anatomy, check out our 1963 video. To keep it simple for today's journey, imagine Chile as a giant body. The factories were the muscles, System 1, and the government in Santiago was the higher consciousness, System 5. In 1966, the challenge was the spinal cord. In a country 4,000 kilometers long, how does information travel from a copper mine in the burning northern desert to a planning office in the snowy south? Beer realized that if the information took months to arrive, the body was effectively paralyzed. They needed a nervous system that functioned in real time. This realization led to one of the most ingenious scavenger hunts in history, Project Chimba. Chapter 4, Project Chimba, the Scavenger Hunt for Data. By the end of 1966, the team realized they couldn't wait for IBM or NASA to give them high-tech computers. They had to innovate with what was already on the ground. They began searching government basements and forgotten warehouses. What they found were 500 unused telex machines. In 1966, these were the smartphones of the era, clunky, noisy, and mechanical. But for Beer, they were enough. He didn't need high-resolution video, he needed bits of data. The team began a massive logistical operation, transporting these machines across the Andes. They were building the world's first national network. Think about the audacity of this. In 1966, the ARPANET, the precursor to our internet, was barely a whisper in U.S. military labs. Yet, in Chile, they were already plugging factories into a central brain. It was a startup atmosphere. Young engineers were sleeping in their offices, writing code on punch cards, and dreaming of a world where data could eliminate poverty. Chapter 5, The Opsroom, Designing a War Room for Peace. As the network grew, Beer knew they needed a place to process this nervous energy. This is where the Opsroom comes in. While the physical room wasn't fully finished until later, the design philosophy was solidified in the late 60s. Beer hated the way modern executives worked, buried in paper, disconnected from reality. He wanted the Opsroom to be a Gestalt environment. He hired Goebanseep, a visionary from the Ohm School of Design. They decided on a hexagonal shape. Why? Because a hexagon has no head of the table. They designed white fiberglass chairs that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. These chairs were the first human-computer interfaces. In 1966, they were conceptualizing buttons, not keyboards, to allow ministers to interact with data. They wanted to lower the barrier between a human thought and an economic decision. It wasn't about control, it was about clarity. They wanted the leaders to look at the shape of the country's health, not just a list of cold numbers. Chapter 6, Cyberstride, Predicting the Future in 1966. Inside the computers, a ghost was being born, Cyberstride. This was the software that managed the incoming telex data. We briefly touched on the law of requisite variety in our 1963 VSM video, which states that only variety can absorb variety. In 1966, the Chilean team applied this law to the economy. Cyberstride used Bayesian statistical models to filter the noise of daily production. If a factory's output was slightly low, the computer stayed silent. But if the drop was statistically significant, a crisis signal, it would alert the Opsroom. This was the world's first algorithmic management system. It was designed to prevent the central government from micromanaging. As long as things were within a healthy range, the workers were left completely alone. The electronic eye only opened when the body was in trouble. This was the ultimate balance between freedom and coordination. Chapter 7, The Algedonic Loop, The Citizen's Voice. Perhaps the most radical part of the 1966 experiments was the algedonic loop. Stafford Beer knew that an economy isn't just about steel and copper, it's about people. He proposed a joy-pain sensor. He wanted a system where workers in a remote village could move a dial to indicate their satisfaction. In 1966, they were theorizing how to bypass the slow, corruptible cycles of voting and give people a direct, real-time channel to the government. Algedonic comes from the Greek words for pain and pleasure. If a town was suffering, a red light would pulse in the Opsroom. This was meant to be the ultimate democratic tool. But even in 1966, the shadows were forming. Could this be used for surveillance? Could the electronic eye become the big brother? The team wrestled with these ethical questions late into the night, fueled by black coffee and the hope that they were building a utopia. Chapter 8, The Shadow of the Eagle and the Test of 1972. As the 60s drew to a close, the world started to take notice. The CIA and the Nixon administration began to realize that Chile wasn't just experimenting with socialism, they were experimenting with a superintelligence that could make traditional economic warfare obsolete. The real test came in 1972, during the Great Truck Strike. The system that was born from the 1966 blueprints was suddenly the only thing standing between the country and total starvation. 200 trucks against 40,000. Using the telex network and the Cyberstride algorithms, the team managed the national logistics with surgical precision. They defeated the blockade without a single shot being fired. They proved that a digital brain could win a war of attrition. But as the electronic eye watched the country survive, the enemies of the revolution realized they couldn't just stop the politics, they had to destroy the machine itself. Chapter 5, The Opsroom, A Temple for the Future. By the late 1960s, the dream of 1966 needed a physical heart. This wasn't just an office, it was the world's first management environment. Stafford Beer, alongside German designer Goebanseep, created a space that looked like it belonged on a Kubrick film set. The Opsroom was a hexagonal chamber tucked away in downtown Santiago. The hexagon was chosen specifically to destroy hierarchy. In a square room, someone sits at the head. In a circle, there is no focus. But a hexagon allowed for 7 swivel chairs, made of white fiberglass and brown leather, to be arranged in a way that encouraged face-to-face debate. The most revolutionary part? The data walls. In 1966, high-resolution monitors didn't exist for the public. Instead, the walls were covered in frosted glass screens. Behind these screens was a team of young graphic artists. Every morning, they would receive the latest data from the telex network, hand-paint transparent slides, and load them into a massive, hidden carousel projector system. When a minister in the room pressed one of the geometric buttons on their chair's armrest, the projector would snap a new slide into place. It was a mechanical, analog precursor to the modern dashboard. It was tactile, clicking and whirring as the country's economic health was visualized in glowing light. Chapter 6, Cyberstride, the Bayesian brain in the machine. If the Opsroom was the body, Cyberstride was the subconscious mind. Written in 1966 and 1967, this software was light years ahead of its time. While the Soviet Union was trying to calculate every single nail in every single crate, a task that would take 1,000 years, the Chilean team used Bayesian probability. As we discussed in our 1963 video regarding the law of requisite variety, a system must be able to handle the complexity of its environment. Cyberstride was the filter. It was programmed with adaptive filtering. It established a statistical normal for every factory. If a textile mill in the north produced within its expected range, the computer stayed silent. But if the production dropped or spiked significantly, the computer flagged an anomalous event. This was management by exception. It allowed a small team in Santiago to oversee an entire nation's industry without micromanaging. They weren't looking at spreadsheets, they were looking for variations. They were looking for the signals of pain or success amidst the noise of a chaotic economy. Cyberstride was essentially the first real-time economic diagnostic tool ever built. Chapter 7, The Algedonic Loop, the Citizen's Joy and Pain. Now, we reach the most daring and perhaps most controversial experiment of the Cybersyn era, the Algedonic Loop. In 1966, Stafford Beer became obsessed with the idea of social sensors. He argued that economic data, tons of copper, liters of oil, wasn't enough. You could have a successful factory where the workers were dying of exhaustion. The Algedonic Loop, from the Greek algos for pain and hedon for pleasure, was meant to be a direct line of communication from the citizen to the state. Beer proposed installing simple devices in factories and villages, boxes with a single dial. A worker could walk up and turn the dial to indicate their level of satisfaction with their environment. This signal traveled instantly to the Opsroom. If a whole community turned their dials to pain, a red light would pulse on the Santiago map. It was meant to be a biometric of democracy. It allowed the government to feel a crisis before a protest even began. In 1966, this was the first conceptual attempt at a social network, a way for the masses to give instant feedback to the centers of power. But the question remained, who holds the other end of the wire? Could this pain sensor be used by a future tyrant to find the unhappy and silence them? Chapter 8, The Great Test, the October Strike of 1972. Everything built from the 1966 blueprints was put to the ultimate test in October 1972. The CIA-backed Capitol strike saw 40,000 truck owners paralyze the nation. They stopped the flow of food, fuel, and medicine. Chile is a narrow strip of land. Without trucks, the country dies. The government had only 200 trucks that remained loyal. Statistically, the government should have collapsed in days. But they had the telex network. The Cybersyn team turned the Opsroom into a 24/7 war room. They used the real-time data flow to track every single loyalist truck. They used the Cyberstride algorithms to calculate the most critical routes, where would a liter of milk or a bag of flour do the most good. They bypassed the 40,000 strikers by being infinitely more efficient with their 200 trucks. For nearly a month, the country was managed by a computer network and a handful of dedicated scientists. They won. The strike failed. The electronic eye had kept the nation alive. It was the first time in history a computer system saved a government from economic warfare. But this victory was a double-edged sword. It proved to the world and to the CIA that Cybersyn was too powerful to be allowed to exist. The digital brain had to be destroyed. Chapter 9, The Shadow of the Eagle, the Invisible Blockade. As the 1970s progressed, Project Cybersyn was no longer a secret research project, it was a geopolitical target. In Washington, D.C., the Nixon administration viewed the electronic eye not as a scientific marvel, but as a dangerous expansion of Marxist power. The CIA's objective, as famously dictated by Richard Nixon, was to make the Chilean economy scream. The American intelligence community realized that traditional economic sabotage, cutting off spare parts for copper mines or blocking international credit, might not work if Chile could optimize its internal resources via a computer network. They feared that Stafford Beer had given the Global South a digital shield. This led to a covert war of information. While the Chilean engineers were trying to expand the telex network, the CIA was funding opposition groups to sabotage the physical lines. The success of the 1972 strike we mentioned earlier didn't just save Allende, it convinced the enemies of the state that the brain had to be severed from the body. The 1966 dream of a unified national nervous system was now operating in a state of constant electronic siege. Chapter 10, September 11, 1973, The Silence of the Telex. The morning of September 11, 1973, began with a chilling silence. The military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, seized the telecommunications centers first. They knew that in a cybernetic state, communication is life. As the Hawker Hunter jets began their bombing runs on the Moneda Palace, the 500 telex machines across the country started spitting out their final, frantic messages before going dark forever. Inside the Cybersyn offices, the atmosphere was a mix of terror and tragic duty. The young scientists, men and women who had spent years coding the science of liberty, were now burning documents. They weren't just burning technical manuals, they were burning the lists of factory workers involved in the algedonic loops. They knew that if the military found those names, the joy-pain sensors would be used to identify and execute dissidents. The digital nervous system was being lobotomized in real time. As Allende made his final radio broadcast, the electronic eye of Chile went blind. Chapter 11, Iconoclasm, The Smashed Mirrors of Utopia. When Pinochet's soldiers finally entered the hexagonal Opsroom, they didn't see progress. They saw Marxist witchcraft. The sight of the white fiberglass chairs and the glowing geometric buttons confused and enraged them. To a military mind built on rigid, top-down hierarchy, the idea of a decentralized, self-managing economy was a threat to the very concept of order. What followed was an act of pure iconoclasm. The soldiers smashed the frosted glass screens with their rifle butts. They tore the wiring from the walls. They kicked in the carousels of hand-painted data slides, turning years of research into shards of colorful plastic. They didn't just turn off the system, they tried to erase the very memory that it ever existed. The Chicago boys, economists trained under Milton Friedman, were brought in to replace Beer's algorithms with a brutal, unregulated market model. Chile became the world's first laboratory for neoliberalism, but it was built on the physical and digital ruins of a democratic socialist dream. Chapter 12, The Wizard in the Woods, The Hermit of Wales. The aftermath for Stafford Beer was a slow, agonizing transformation. He was in London when the coup happened, watching the news in horror as his friends were imprisoned or killed. He realized that the technology he built to liberate people had made them targets. The guilt was transformative. Beer abandoned his expensive suits and his consulting firm. He moved to a tiny, isolated cottage in the mountains of Wales named Llandaboy. He lived without running water or electricity for a time, growing a long, white beard and practicing tantric yoga. He stopped being a management consultant and became a philosopher-poet. He spent his final decades warning the world that technology without ethics is just a faster way to tyranny. He saw the early internet beginning to form in the 90s and predicted exactly what would happen, that corporations would steal the cybernetic dream to monitor and control us for profit. He died in 2002, a man who had seen the future in 1966 and spent the rest of his life trying to warn us that we weren't ready for it. Chapter 13, The Digital Ghost, From Santiago to Silicon Valley. Today, the ghost of Project Cybersyn is everywhere. When you look at an Amazon fulfillment center, where every movement of a worker is tracked by an algorithm to ensure maximum efficiency, you are seeing the dark side of cyberstride. The predictive analytics used by Google or Facebook to anticipate your desires are the direct descendants of the Chilean experiments. But there is one vital piece missing in 2026, the algedonic loop. Our modern systems have the pain/pleasure sensors, likes, views, engagement, but they aren't used to help the government serve the people. They are used to keep us addicted and to maximize profit. We have the electronic eye, but it no longer has a human heart. As we close this journey on Synapse Daily, remember that the 1966 experiments in Chile weren't a failure because the science was wrong. They were a failure because the world wasn't ready for a system that prioritized human flourishing over power. Project Cybersyn remains a haunting what-if in the history of technology, a reminder that a different kind of internet, and a different kind of world, was once within our reach. Thank you for joining us. If you haven't seen our 1963 video on the foundations of the VSM, go watch it now to see where this all began. Like this video if you learned something new. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe for more fascinating stories.